Welcome to part 2 of the vision pillar in the Dynamic Leadership series. In part 1, we established that having a vision is a prerequisite for building a high-performance environment. We also discussed the challenges that come with pursuing a vision, because by nature, vision is aspirational. That means we'll face obstacles and our employees will not always get it right the first time, especially when they're pushing the boundaries of innovation. One of the biggest traps leaders fall into is treating progress as pass-fail. But when we default to this mindset, we discourage risk-taking and inadvertently suppress the very creativity and effort required to achieve our vision. Struggling at the edge of ability is what drives growth and makes your organization more effective long-term, which is what you need to realize your lofty vision. This is where the distinction between operational excellence and project excellence becomes critical. Operational excellence is about efficiency and consistency, while project excellence is about navigating uncertainty and learning from iteration. Given the speed of external change, innovation is no longer optional. It's a necessary capability of any business that intends to scale. Today, we'll bridge the gap between vision, the aspirational future we're striving toward, and the daily interactions that either reinforce or contradict that vision. Under pressure, it's easy to slip into behaviors that send mixed signals, and we'll examine 2 specific ways that this happens. 1, when leaders make their response equal their reaction, allowing stress or frustration to shape their communication in ways that undermine long-term goals. And the 2nd, when leaders unintentionally shut down enthusiasm for innovation by creating setbacks as failures rather than steps in an iterative learning process. Both of these behaviors affect intrinsic motivation, the internal drive that fuels an employee's engagement and performance. When we get this right, employees feel strong, a sense of ownership, and alignment with the organization's vision. When we get it wrong, they disengage, and over time, they seek environments where their contributions are valued. They may stay in the role, but their heart is somewhere else. Later in this series, we'll explore development plans and structured feedback mechanisms to help your leadership team build the skills needed to stay on track with your vision. Today, we'll focus on simple, actionable ways to ensure your daily leadership interactions support rather than contradict the culture you're building. Now, I'll start with something that probably happens regularly in your communications. And I'll point out that in this series, I'm providing the landscape of dynamic leadership, which I have stated is the ideal leadership style for small businesses seeking to grow and scale. That's important because when you're growing and scaling, each level you hit, and it's going to be different for different organizations, but let's say the difference between $1 million and $3 million in revenue can be a dramatic shift. And then there's another dramatic shift, somewhere around 5 or 6 million. Again, it changes because of the amount of outsourcing that you're doing, the amount of artificial intelligence that's involved. But as you think about the spans of control, when you jump another 2 spans, you have a significantly different organization. And spans of control don't just have to do with the employees inside. It also has to do with the virtual teams that you're working with, the contractors, etc. And if you think about it as attention units, it starts to make sense. And I said last week, having a span of control of 8 makes sense, but if you're the owner, you may want to reduce that to something like 5 because you need those other attention units to focus on other areas, whether it's environment, political, administration with the city, state governance, and what have you. It makes sense, if you're a small organization like that, hiring the first person on your leadership team earlier than you think you need them. There's always going to be work that they can do. And as we get into the development plans, you'll start to see how that unfolds, that hiring people early is actually not the expense that you might think it is. It actually opens some doors to opportunities. Everything within reason, of course, but we'll get into that later. So in this illustration today, I want to talk about 2 things. The first one has to do with when we are in an interaction with an employee. I use employee, recognize that it could be an independent contractor, it could be a virtual team member. All of these folks that you're hiring, you have importance to them because they're getting revenue from you. And depending on how big your slice of their revenue is, it could be just like an employee, even though it's an independent contractor or a virtual team member. But either way, if they are going to be wired to make sure that you're happy. So let's start with an input. And this input can be a person or a situation that happens. That input creates or represents a stimulus for you. And they tell us that we have over 30,000 stimulus response cycles in a day. Paraphrasing a bit there, because the actual stat is that we make 33,000 decisions per day. But in keeping with the idea that 95% of our lives are run by habit, you can see that most of those 33,000 decisions, the large majority of them, are stimulus response cycles. And assuming we have about 60 to 65,000 seconds that we're awake every day, that turns into a stimulus response every other second. So I just want to put some context around how could we be making 33,000 decisions in a day? Well, when you're thinking about stimulus response and you consider that the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second, you get there. This represents a stimulus, and this stimulus is going to create a reaction. As the leader, you have honed your reactions based on experience. In fact, if I'm speaking about your leadership team is in place probably because of their past results and past performance. When you consider reactions are also associations, right? The stimulus response cycle is associations. Associations are largely from the past, which means if you're in innovation mode, many of those reactions will probably not be optimal for the current situation. Said another way, if you're allowing your reaction to equal your response, you're probably creating some resistance. What we want to do is get it so that our input, it will lead to a reaction, but that reaction is just a data point. We're not going to let the reaction equal the response. And this is what happens for most of us. When we say that our lives are run 95% by habit, we're in essence allowing the reaction to equal the response. And when you think about people being triggered, you can see that they are saying and doing things that are out of line with how they really believe or expect to be acting. So what we're going to do is make the shift so that the input, it does cause that reaction, but that reaction is a data point. If you're operating in operating mode, many of those inputs happened before. And I'm talking about an input. It could be there's a problem, somebody asks a question, they make a statement, they share a point of view, whatever that is. In operational mode, this data point probably represents a larger percentage of your data gathering in that moment. And by the way, this whole thing is a half a second. So this is happening very fast. And because the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second, it works. We can do what I'm talking about here. That reaction is then going to inform our response. We're still talking within that half second. So we're wasting about a quarter of a second by letting the reaction equal the response. I'm not going to say wasting it, but in play, we have cognitive biases, obviously the associations. We say that neurons that fire together wire together. So it's not just the associations that are related to that. It's also the other associations that happen in that same moment, and then other heuristics. So cognitive bias is a heuristic, but also so a meta program. So in other words, neurons that fire together wire together. If it happens over and over and over, you end up with this bundling of associations, and that can become a meta program, which is how we get through the day, because we're not thinking about every single thing. We're leveraging the speed of the subconscious. And what we're going to do is slow this process down, but we're going to do it at this point, and then we'll do it again here. The reason we're doing it this way is because this reaction can happen in less than a quarter of a second. The conscious mind doesn't come online for about a half second. So looking at it like this, the stimulus to reaction is about a quarter of a second. And it could be faster than that for people who are trained, or if you're in a highly stressed state already, high beta, you're probably going to be a lot faster with that. If you're in alpha state, it's going to be slower. But the speed, especially if you're stressed, the speed is going to be faster. And then the conscious mind comes online at a half second. The conscious mind only processes 50 bits per second. So with the subconscious processing at 11 million bits per second, the conscious processing at 50 bits per second, you can see the conscious is completely outgunned. But in innovating, you really want the conscious mind to have a larger say. And we're talking about vision. This is where the vision comes into play, right? You've got to consider the vision. And that's why I talk about we can get away from the vision if we just allow our reaction to be the response. In operational mode, you're probably not hurting yourself much, but when you're talking about innovating, you're creating some problems here. Something I didn't mention is that between reaction and response, sometimes your response will be to do something. Sometimes it will be to delay making a decision. Sometimes it will be to disregard it. It's not important right now. Or maybe you're not even going to deal with it. And sometimes it might be to delegate it. It might be something like, yes, we need to deal with this, but why don't you take it to so-and-so and I'll give them a heads up that you're going to be calling them. Those are 4 Ds. You do it, delay it, disregard it, or delegate it. Any of those can be that response that comes after you do that assessment from the reaction. Remember, the reaction is just a data point. I hope you agree that this is better than having a knee-jerk reaction, which becomes a knee-jerk response based on past associations and not necessarily supportive of your vision. Another thing I'll add is that your subconscious looks at the unfamiliar as risk and danger. And I've said that in earlier ones. You can go back and take a look at how I draw that diagram. And it creates this cognitive dissonance. And because excitement and cognitive dissonance can have the same signature as anxiety, that can trigger some other anxious feelings or some stress. And again, neurons that fire together wire together. So now you're off into this fight or flight just because the person asks you a question. They have an innocent question, a logical question based on where they are in the innovation, and we're going to fight or flight. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to condition in a simple positivity exercise, and that positivity exercise will slow the subconscious down on its looking for danger. If you think about the subconscious, its purpose is to keep us alive long enough to procreate. So obviously it's biased towards looking for risks and danger. But when you're going after your vision, we have to accept some of the unfamiliar. And if that unfamiliar looks like danger, when it shows up, what we want, the subconscious may have that fight or flight. So what we're going to do is condition in a positivity drill. And again, I do it inside this because we've got to get it to where it's a heuristic. By doing it as a heuristic, it's already conditioned. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why people have a hard time breaking habits, is because the habit, what they want, the goal, the desire, is on the conscious mind side, and that doesn't come in till a half second, and that's at 50 bits per second. Meanwhile, the subconscious has a quarter of a second jump on the conscious mind, but also because of the 11 million bits per second of processing, it's got a million or 2 bits of information that it's already thought about. You've got the reticular activating system jumping in there, the neurons that fire together and are now wired together. All of that's coming into play. It's giving your conscious mind what it thinks your conscious mind needs. So we have to shift this. And here's the positivity drill. It's a drill, and I've talked before about muscle memory is not really muscle memory, it's nervous system memory, right? The muscles don't fire on their own. It's a neural pathway that's firing the muscle. Neural pathways fire thoughts. Neural pathways are what we use when we speak. So anything that we're talking about when it comes to habit, you can consider that what we're dealing with neural pathways. And it takes drills to change them. You can't change it with conscious thinking because it's one, it's happening too fast, and two, your conscious mind is not even aware of the stimulus in time, so it's getting bad information. And what's more is that because the neural pathway, that's energy going through there, it has the same signature as energy that's coming from thought. And so it feels like thinking. Well, it's like, gee, I thought it came from my mind. It must make sense. It must be right. So we end up doubling down and we back into and we justify. The reality is, though, it's not really coming from your mind. It's coming from your network of neurons, which are associations. That's the habits from the past. We can get into more on why that is. But if you look up Myelin, book Talent Code and Grit by Angela Duckworth, they do a good job of explaining myelin, and that's the basis. Understanding that, and then along with synaptogenesis, is the basis for understanding neuroplasticity. And if you're building an organization that's moving towards a vision, it stands to reason that the organization is not where it needs to be yet. It's got to develop there, and an organization is a collection of people, and so neuroplasticity needs to be part of your thinking, maybe not at the employee level, but certainly as you as the owner, and perhaps some of your leadership team needs to be thinking about change management and how neuroplasticity is involved in getting your organization to where they're going to be. So that's why we talk about drills, and this is important for any habit change, that you want to build that habit with a drill, and then better yet, deep practice. But for now, what we're going to do is 3 times a day and 3 reps per set. So 3 times a day, we're going to do 3 reps. And the purpose is to take the bias away from the subconscious to look for danger. And when it does that, when it looks for danger, remember, it sees everything as a potential Serengeti tiger or a tiger on the Serengeti. And it can send us into fight or flight. And the more unfamiliar territory we are in, the more likely that's going to happen. And we don't want to take that risk seeking away completely, but we don't want it to stop us, especially when going in for the vision. So this drill was 3 times a day, 3 reps per set. So it's about 90 seconds because you do it in 30 seconds. You're going to come up with something, going back into your past, that was inconvenient, that may have caused a little tinge of negative emotion. We don't want to start with anything big, small stuff. And I use the example of a flat tire because most of us have experienced that. You get a flat, and the first thought is, what are you going to miss out on? It's going to cost you some money. You're missing a meeting, whatever. You're going to be late. And these emotions flood. And then we go off into fight or flight. And you know that once you're into fight or flight, it's now neurobiological because you're getting, the cortisol is starting to surge through your body. So you're starting to look for more risks. Your adrenaline is staged and ready to go. And sometimes if you've had a big enough experience, maybe you got stopped for speeding or something, and you can feel that adrenaline or that cortisol in your body for sometimes hours after it happens. So we need to stop that, because once it happens, then we're looking at everything from that heightened state of risk concern. So 3 times a day, we're going to do 3 reps, 90 seconds. We're thinking back in the past of some inconvenience that led to a negative emotion. Then, and this is going to be quick, 90 seconds. Step 2 is look for the greater positive context. In the case of the flat tire with the car, the greater positive context is that we have a car. Now, this is not positive thinking. It's not reframing. It's not rah-rah stuff. You are training your subconscious to do something in the pre-conscious phase of stimulus response. So you're drilling it. You're teaching it, when this happens, do this. When this happens, do this. When this happens, do this. You're teaching the subconscious to do this the same way habits are formed. Habits are formed by, I do this, I get that. I do this, I get that. That's what we're doing. The third thing you're going to do is focus on the gratitude for that context. So in this case, what we're talking about, the greater positive context, is that I have a car. Now, at one point, having a car was probably a goal. If you don't have a car, then you come up with your own example. At some point, that positive, that context of a car was a goal, and by the subconscious learning to look for the positive, the greater positive context, once it sees that, oh, that inconvenient thing is part of this greater positive context and it was a goal, then it's no longer a threat. I'm going to go look for some other threats. And by doing that and then come up with two more, each set, and I did it with meals when I first did this, and it takes about 6 weeks. Do this for 6 weeks every day. And I did it with meals because it was an easy time, 2 minutes before I eat. And what you'll find happening within a week or two is that as negative things come up, you will automatically see that this is not a bad thing. And what it does is it prevents those additional neurons from firing. It stops them in their tracks because it's not a threat. So it takes a different path. It looks for something else. That's okay. It's like a hunter-gatherer coming up to another figure on the trail, and they're first thinking, is this an enemy? Is it a threat? Is it what's going to happen? Does he have weapons? This exercise teaches us that those things that are aligned with our vision, that's what ends up happening, right? If it's aligned with the vision, then it's okay. It gets to pass. So you're going to build this getting progressively harder and harder, or progressively more intense emotions each time you do it. Just go more and more and more intense to the point where really scary things are seen in the greater positive context, and you'll feel the emotion just flowing away, and then start pushing it in real time as things happen. 6 weeks, that's the positivity drill. And by the way, so when I talk about this, I have to remind people that you actually have to not only have to do the work, but you're going to be aware that things are going on. This is why in my 7 fitness areas, I talk about the mental, physical, spiritual, and the spiritual is awareness of awareness. Then you have to do something about it. But people will be aware, but they don't make the step. They don't take the action. And in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, in habit 1, be proactive, he tells you don't continue reading the book until you can go 30 days being proactive. And so you also have to be proactive. This is not going to be done for you. But what you're doing is you're giving yourself an opportunity in that heuristic. And this is going to take care of cognitive biases. It'll take care of associations. It'll take care of difficult situations that you had in the past. It's not going to deal with the phobia level. That's something else that we can talk about. But this is going to keep you from going into fight or flight for many of those milder things. The second thing I want to do, this comes down to empowering employees and having an empowered workforce. You need an empowered workforce. You need them to have freedom of action. And remember, in the self-determination theory, which everything I'll be talking about in this series is filtered through the self-determination theory, which is the basis for intrinsic motivation. I make the case that intrinsic motivation is better than extrinsic motivation for a variety of reasons. Intrinsic is not just that the motivation is coming from inside, it's that they're getting joy from the action itself. So the people doing the work, and they're getting joy from it, the work itself becomes self-reinforcing. They're getting the dopamine hits and the serotonin benefits, but that's coming from the actual work. This is why you need them to have some autonomy, and you need them to have feelings of competence. And of course, the relatedness is part of it. As you build that autonomy and they have additional freedom of action, it means that they can have more responsibility. This is how you can take somebody from an entry-level employee up through the ranks, through supervision and then management, and then potentially the leadership ranks, and possibly even a member of your leadership team as years pass. Now, there's a process to do that, and we'll get into more of that during the developmental plan conversation. But for now, I want to talk about this thing that happens in the moment. So that last thing we talked about was the input and the stimulus response, and it happens in the moment. And the objective is to slow you down a little bit as the leader and give you an opportunity to think about your response with respect to the input that you're getting in the context of being aligned with your vision. Making sure that your response is aligned with that vision, that's the point where we're focusing on here. It represents problem-solving capability, and that problem-solving capability is what the person brings to the table. Most companies hire based on some sort of interviewing. It may include behavioral descriptive interviewing, but regardless of what you're using, you're looking at past performance and results, and then hiring based on what you need today through that lens. When you think about it like that, we're actually hiring people or putting people into positions based on their conditioning. However, when we're innovating, sometimes that past conditioning is not necessarily what we need now. That performance was a point in time, and that point in time could have been going in a different direction than where we're going with this current innovation in the context of our vision. Whatever it is, there's a problem-solving capability that has to do with their network, education, experience, outcomes relative to inputs, temperament. There's so many things that can contribute to problem-solving capability. Everybody's different, and you're going to assess a person's problem-solving capability, and you'll see that as you start empowering people, giving them more responsibility and freedom of action, and then looking at the results that you're getting. So what we want to do is give our employees a point of view with respect to freedom of action and autonomy. So think about it as having the total autonomy to operate, which is in this 80% zone, where 80% of their problem-solving capability, they have that freedom of action, they have the autonomy, they have the authority. We want them to be able to solve their own problems. But when they start getting above that 80% of their problem-solving capability, we run the risk of having them have too much tension or anxiety or concern to be able to operate freely. Now, I say 80%. It's subjective, of course. I'm telling that person that when they feel like they're exceeding 80% of their own problem-solving capability, I want them to get me involved. And this area up here is where we'll be working on it together in some form. It doesn't necessarily mean you're getting in the boat with them. It doesn't mean you're going to be rowing the boat. It just means that you're giving it another set of eyes. You may give them some perspective. You may want to do some of the work yourself, or it may be that you have regular meetings on it. It depends on the situation. But they're getting you involved, and maybe it's just awareness. You could be like, okay, well, just keep me abreast of what's going on. When problems do occur, they're naturally going to try to get out of those problems or solve them on their own initially. But we're losing time. If those problems are above their scope or above their capability, we're losing time. The more time they spend working on getting out of it themselves, yes, they're learning, but also the fewer opportunities it will have to correct it. And when you do get involved, the cost could be higher. As problems age, options tend to decrease, or the expense can go up. When you are involved early, you may give them some coaching, or maybe it's an opportunity for mentoring. At times, you may get in the boat with them. You may even row. You may just stay on the sidelines and watch them and have them give you regular updates. That's the idea here. This approach avoids the fight or flight for you, and it avoids the fight or flight for them. You're keeping them out of those stress responses because they're working within their capabilities, which gives them the opportunity to play loose. You're preventing anxiety-induced, unforced errors in athletic terms. The neurons that fire together wire together, tapping into past anxiety, and now they're getting tight, maybe they're tense, and mistakes happen or get magnified. We're not at our best when we're tense, and we want to keep people at their best. This doesn't mean that we're taking away their learning opportunities. In fact, it can be a form of deep practice, because you're getting involved in the parts where they're going to be struggling. They're in effect struggling on the edge of ability, which is a component of deep practice. And that's how neuroplasticity happens. In this case, you're building your organization, its depth, and the capability. You're raising the problem-solving capability of the organization, which means you're increasing the opportunity for people to have freedom of action, which means you're giving them options to accept and exercise additional responsibility, which is how you're going to grow your leadership team. And it just grows from there. The other thing it does is that it artificially slows down that stress response I was talking about earlier. Earlier we talked about how this stimulus can lead to a reaction which may equal the response. The more stressed we are, the closer we are to already being in fight or flight, the more likely this response is going to be counter to what we need to support the organization's vision. I talked about putting in a positivity exercise step to create a heuristic that happens in between the stimulus or input and the reaction, so that we can now get a response that's more aligned with the vision. You still want to do that positivity exercise. You'll be doing both of these. This process is going to help you by reducing the frequency in a different way. it sort of bypasses that stress response because you're getting involved along the way. There are also other actions that I'll introduce in future segments. You can reduce the reaction equals response problem with mindfulness. We can do it with implementation intentions and also emotional modulation and more. These are tools in your leadership toolbox. It can also be developmental opportunities for your leadership team. These are just two of many shifts in the way we communicate to stack the deck by having a culture and environment that's aligned with the vision. Continuing on with this line of thinking, you have your own problem-solving capability. If you're not the owner, you can have this conversation with your boss. Start working through this framework where you know the 80% of your own problem-solving capability, that point where you're feeling some concern that you're maybe getting out of your area of expertise or your comfort zone. That feeling that you're taking on more than a reasonable amount of risk. Get the boss involved. Let them know that what you're doing, and you're not asking them to do it for you. You're just saying, hey, I want to give you a heads up. I'm working on this thing, and it looks like there might be some areas that are beyond what I'm accustomed to or maybe out of my area of expertise or competence. So I want to get you involved just in case things get off the rails. Now, that's an easy conversation to have, and one that can lead to perhaps some great collaboration. And then you move on and you do it the way you were going to do it anyway. But now as things pop up, there's already a related channel of communication open and you can get there faster. These are just two things that you can start doing right now. The positivity exercise, do it for 6 weeks. You'll start seeing benefits in about 2 weeks, maybe sooner. But keep doing it. And remember, you're doing a drill, you're retraining the subconscious. And then, of course, the awareness of awareness piece. You can't just leave it at awareness, noticing it. You have to obviously do the step 2 and take the right action. And that right action is changing your internal response to the situation from one of stress to, oh, it's going to be okay. Just a normal part of the process. I encourage you to start integrating both of these ideas in your leadership. Next week, I'll continue with additional steps to reduce the likelihood that your actions are leading to dysfunction of your team. Of course, you probably don't think of it as causing dysfunction, but we're looking at things in the context of employees having intrinsic motivation, so you're not having to rely solely on extrinsic, or worse, having disconnects which lead to larger problems, including a difficult work environment. For example, without this conversation, you can see how a leader would say, yes, I want my people to be empowered. I regularly tell them they're empowered to take action, and I remind them that they have freedom of action every day. We're constantly leaning into that conversation. That could be what you hear from a leader. But when you talk to the employees, or maybe there's a 360, and the employees say something like, are you kidding me? There's no way I'm stepping out on that limb again. I did that once, got my head handed to me. Why would they say that if you're telling them they're empowered? It could be because their interpretation of how you show up when you're in the midst of a stress response. Remember, you're their connection to their livelihood. Your actions and words are amplified. Leverage works both ways. You may think of it as a mild reaction from your perspective, but to them, it's like a massive near existential experience. And if you add a little bit of emotion to it, because of your own anxiety that you're feeling in the moment, because you're going to have to deal with the expense or talk to your boss or whatever, that creates this outsized experience for them to the point that they're not going down that path anymore. Yet you're telling them that they're empowered. You can see the disconnect. A leader may never connect those two things on their own. By practicing in this way with the positivity process and the problem-solving capability-based limited authority or autonomy, you're doing a lot towards removing that possibility. Next week, I'll introduce additional steps you can take as a leader or owner to align your environment with your vision. I'll see you next week.